Hello, friends. Happy New Year and welcome back to the Concussion Nerds podcast. I feel like it's been weeks since we've been together one on one, you and me. And in truth, I mean, when I think about it, it probably has been. Last week we had a guest, the week before we took the week off because of Christmas. Today's episode, we're going to be starting to talk into now persistent concussion symptoms, as in it's been a month and I still have concussion symptoms. So now what? But before I dive into that, I just want to say I hope that y'all took a little bit of time. Okay, I always laugh that I say y'all when I'm Canadian. You all. Tangent. I hope that y'all took a little bit of time for some rest, for some restoration, for some rejuvenation for yourself over the holidays, whether that was solo time, time with your family, an adventure, whatever that means for you, because you know what? It's different for every single one of us. I took some time. My son and I went up into the interior of BC to visit my parents and my grandparents and my other grandparents and a ton of cousins. And I left that trip with a whole new appreciation for how close my family is. I look at them and how often they talk and how often they hang out. And like the generations hang out, right? Like the kids hang out with the parents, hang out with the grandparents, the kids hang out with the aunts and uncles, and everyone is just amazing friends. And I looked at my family because I don't see them very often, right? I don't live close to them. And they all live within like a 20-minute radius of each other. And I looked at my family and I was like, what a gift. What a gift. And that every time I go up there, even if I haven't seen them for years, they welcome me and Hudson and my family with open freaking arms. It's like, oh, it just filled my heart in a different way, right? I think the older we get, the more life we live, the more gratitudes we have for things. And this was the first time I've always known it and I've always appreciated it. But I walked away and I drove home and Hudson and I came home and I was journaling last night and I was like, what a freaking gift. What a gift. It's magic. I love it. Here's the other thing. Who here listening to this podcast, like if you actually have, like, please send me a DM on Instagram because I'm curious who here has gone ice fishing before. I shared with two of my biz besties that my dad was super excited to take Hudson and I ice fishing. And it was the first time I had gone ice fishing since I was a kid. And my one girlfriend was like, what is that? And I shared with her, I'm like, oh, I haven't been since I was literally a kid. And she was like, oh, this is a thing. It's a thing, Canadian, growing up in winters. And it was so funny because while ice fishing has totally changed as an adult experience versus a kid experience, right? I look at when I was a kid and I wanted to be stimulated, I wanted to do things, I wanted to run and play. And as an adult, especially an adult who I am today, to treasure that time with my family, to just be able to sit in nature and in stillness and admire the beauty around me. It was a completely different experience. And then the other thing too is, I talk about in the concussion space all the time, and we're going to be talking about this more this month, to be honest. I talk about in the concussion space on how we need to step away from all the old school, outdated, traditional rehab approaches for concussion because they don't serve our clients, right? Like we can't do cookie cutter things. We can't do the same thing with every single client. And we have a habit sometimes of clinicians on falling back on that, right? And because that just doesn't serve our clients, every individual is unique and we need to evolve. We need to innovate, we need to integrate, and we need to do all these things. And it's so funny because I had this thought this morning as I was getting ready to film this podcast that even ice fishing has evolved with technology. Like when I was a kid, ice fishing was you bundled up in a one-piece snowsuit. I had this like purple one-piece snowsuit with elastic ankles and like pink and white stripes on the chest and my big toque. And I like walked like a marshmallow because I was very warm. So it was freezing, it was like minus 25 or 30 Celsius. And we would go to the ice, and my dad had, and it's called an auger. So this manual thing that you like screw like this. And it was like all your force to like dig a hole in the ice. So then you scooped it out and then you dropped your fishing rod in and then you sat and you sat Ice fishing this time, and that was ice fishing, literally, and you sat for hours and you kept your fingers crossed that you caught some fish. Ice fishing this time is we get to the lake and my dad pulls out his auger. It's still an auger, except this time you put a drill on top and you press the button and it like screws into the ice within like, I don't know, 3 seconds. So like that's new. And then my dad's setting up the hole for Hudson and he's got this like, I didn't really ask what it was, but I think it was like sonar type thing. You put this transducer in the water and it's a screen and it shows you how deep the lake is. And you like put this cool bait on your fishing rod. You drop your bait in and it shows you how deep your actual line is. So you know where you are in the lake. And then it has the signal so you can actually see when fish come into your like sphere so you could give your bait a little wiggle. Anyways, long story short, even ice fishing has evolved in terms of technology. And so I just love coming back and seeing these experiences in life as a whole, right? Life as a whole of what is a new awareness of something in my world that I haven't fully appreciated before. And so I got that for sure. And then that other piece of let's pay attention to see what else didn't need to evolve that did and the cool ways that happened. And then I come back to my own field. And I think some of the biggest lessons I learn are the lessons I do learn when I extrapolate and pull myself out of the physical rehab space into life and then come back into the rehab space with the lessons that I teach. And it comes back to the traditional approaches aren't working, right? The old school advice isn't working. And every time a client has shifted into the persistent concussion stage. And what does this mean? Persistent concussion, depending on where you read, but ultimately, if your symptoms have lasted longer than 30 days, you would fall into persistent concussion symptoms or post concussion syndrome. It's still called both, but you are going to see more, and you do see more persistent concussion symptoms. So anything beyond that 30 days for an adult would fall into that window. And anytime a client's falling into that window and they come and they sit in my clinic or they message me on Instagram and we're talking about like their care plan or we're doing a virtual consult, depending on where you are in the world, I always ask, what have we done to date? Right? What has this journey looked like to date? Because healing is a journey. We can do things to help it move forward, but we can't make it instant, right? So it is a journey. So I always ask, what has this journey looked like for you to date? And when they start sharing with me the old school tradition, when I say like traditional, I'm thinking those older methods of concussion recovery, of the outdated advice, the really poor outdated protocols, siloed care. And by siloed care, I mean you're looking at one thing and working on one thing only. You haven't explored that full picture of what's contributing to the symptom and to the client sitting in front of us. And anytime I hear these stories, it just like, that's what happens. I grumble or I grit my teeth and I have to bite my tongue sometimes because, I shared this on social already too, but I do believe wholeheartedly that clinicians come into healthcare because they want to help people. We wouldn't be a healthcare provider if we didn't want to help people. The problem is that when you're in this space and the longer you're in this space, people can get jaded or they fall back on things that have worked in the past. And so they just keep falling back to that thing and hoping it works for everyone. But here's the thing, concussions don't work that way. Every single concussion is unique. Is there commonalities? Yes, 100%. There are themes and there are tools and there are, I say frameworks, as in like a way of thinking to ensure that you've explored all the different avenues and you've put your detective hat on and you've looked at all the clues. But there is not a protocol that works the same for every single person. Case in point, I know we're talking about persistent. I'm going to go to an acute client that I had recently. An amazing human, had really been doing nothing for 2.5 weeks by the time they got to me, and started them on our acute concussion protocol, which is actually like a framework, because within that framework, we shift, adapt, evolve for the person in front of me. And that's absolutely what we did for this person. And then they started making progress. Yay. Yes, that's the goal. But so often what happens is people get given a protocol and then they're not supported or guided through it, or it's not shifted or adapted to their unique needs. And then When someone shifts into persistent concussion, then it's a whole different picture. So let's just like squash a myth here. Not every concussion heals in 3 days, 10 days, 14 days. Okay. Concussion can, and I don't say this to scare you. Please, if you are someone on a journey listening to this and you are in a new space, I do not say this to scare you, but concussion for some individuals can take months and in some cases years to recover from. For many people that fall into the months and the years, at least from my clinical experience, has been the journey has not been optimal, right? So whether it's been really poor care, whether there's been trauma layers involved, whether there's been other stressors involved, whether there's socioeconomic factors involved, there's so many things that can contribute to persistent concussion. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about here. So say you've done, right? So you're now moving into 30 days. So regardless of what you've done up to this point, right? We have episodes that talk about acute concussion. We have episodes that give you some guidance on how to begin exercising after concussion. If you are an acute concussion person and you haven't listened to those, please go listen to those episodes of this podcast. Okay. But persistent means it's been beyond 30 days and you still have concussion symptoms. Now, we used to say that 80% of individuals recovered within 2 weeks, 14 days. But there were more than one substantial studies released in a couple of years ago, I think now, that showed that for some, those numbers are actually like those are inaccurate. And a lot of those studies are done on sport concussion, right? We have to remember that concussion can come from sport, from MVAs, from workplace accidents, like from falls. There's so many other reasons that concussion happens. And so there was 2 studies released in the same year that said, no, actually, and what they looked at with their multiple hundreds of subjects within their studies was that between one study said 43%, one study said more than 56% of individuals have still not returned to their functional baselines 6 months after their injury. So what I hope this already demonstrates is that this doesn't mean as a client that you sit and do nothing for 6 months. And as a clinician, I hope this shows you the need for your services in this space. Because when you look at the millions of concussions that happen in the United States a year and the hundreds of thousands of concussions that happen in Canada, and then the rest of the world, I don't even know the statistics, to be honest. And when you look at those reported statistics, the thought is that it's only 50% because those reported statistics come from emergency rooms. And how many concussions don't go to emergency? Okay, there's my tangent, right? We need therapists and clinicians and health providers who are passionate about this area to help individuals on this persistent journey. So, numero uno is if you are on this journey and you have not connected with a clinician who can support you in a very holistic, multifaceted, integrative way, especially if you have persistent symptoms, and I'll explain what that means in more in a minute, please connect with somebody. Message me on Instagram. And if I have someone in your area, I will refer them. We have concussion nerds around Canada and the US specifically. We also have nerds in New Zealand. We have a couple nerds in Australia, right? Concussion nerds are individuals who have gone through my mentorship program and have worked with me specifically to help teach them how to do a more integrative rehab approach and a holistic approach for client care. So if you are listening to this, send me a message. And if I can connect you with someone, I absolutely will. Persistent symptoms need that bigger approach, right? Because if we're looking at persistent symptoms, then we need to find out what the driver is to the symptoms and why you're having. We don't just treat symptoms, right? And if you remember, if you've listened to the phenotype podcast, it's because symptoms, the same symptom, can come from multiple different places and roots. Okay. So, what we need to be having and what we need to be creating is an integrative, multi systems rehabilitation approach to assessment and treatment. And I mean that in terms of from the neurophysiology perspective and then from the person perspective. So, what do I mean by this? Number one, from just a physiology perspective, if you are seeing someone or you are a clinician who a concussion client has come to you and you have not done a full scoping, at least at minimum screen, but at 30 days, an assessment of the different systems that we know can be impacted from concussion, then please either get yourself some education to know how to do that or refer to someone who can support. Now, that does not mean you need to stop treating clients, but siloed care where we just work on one area and we don't think about how that impacts the other systems does not work in persistent concussion. Okay. And by that, I mean, what are you doing to assess the neck? What are you doing to assess the vestibular system? What are you doing to assess the visual system, the autonomic nervous system, somatosensory system, the affective system, and cognition? What are you doing? And do you have a toolbox? And are you confident in the toolbox to assess those systems to see how each one is functioning on its own and how they are integrating and communicating with each other? Do you understand how when you apply certain vestibular rehab tools, that affects the autonomic nervous system or that affects the way the brain prioritizes somatosensory versus visual information? These things exist. And when we can understand how those things talk to each other, how they integrate with each other, and how we as clinicians can truly put on that detective hat. If you could see me on my screen, I'm like putting on a pretend hat and holding up a magnifying glass. But how we can put on our detective hat or put on our magnifying glass to really look deeper into each of these systems. And I don't mean that it necessarily needs tech. Yes, we have technology in my clinic, but there's so much you can do at bedside if you know what you're looking for. And so do we have the tools to look? And do you have the confidence and the ability and the skill set and the knowledge to look deeper at each of these systems and then be able to step back and be like, oh, okay, well, if we can address this piece here, we know that's going to domino into cognition and autonomics and the somatosensory piece. If we do this first, then let's do our somatosensory intervention. Now, if I'm sitting here and I'm talking about this and you're sitting here and you're listening to this and you're like, or like, screw you, Natasha, like, can you like tell us what it is? Like, please just breathe because we were never taught this, right? We were not taught how to think this way in physical therapy school, in chiropractic school, in athletic therapy school, I'm not sure about osteopathic school, but in, in massage therapy school, right? This is not the way we were taught. So it's also not your fault if you don't understand how these systems work in this way. And it's also not your fault if you haven't been applying your concussion rehabilitation strategies and treatment plans in this way because you've never been taught it. But now I want you to learn it because from a persistent concussion perspective, those symptoms are still there because something hasn't been addressed. So from just the neurophysiology perspective, we really do want, if it hasn't already happened, that integrative multi-systems deep dive assessment to be able to then step back and look at what's working well within each system, what's not working well within each system, and how do these systems talk to each other? And where might that talking be falling apart? When we think of like, who remembers the game Chinese telephone? Right. So even just think in elementary school, so I'm clearly going back to my childhood for all these things here today. When you think back to elementary school, and one of my favorite games was Chinese telephone. We think we played it in like kindergarten, right? Where some person whispers something into someone's ear and then it gets passed around the room, right? So you're sitting in a circle and you whisper to the next person and the next person and the next person, and you're whispering what you're hearing. And lo and behold, every time, every freaking time, the last person would repeat what they had heard, and it was not the same message that started. And sometimes it was vastly different. Sometimes it was in like zero relation to what we started with. And sometimes it might have been a few words different. But think about it in the sense of the game of Chinese telephone, that original message is the incoming piece of sensory information, whatever it is. And then each person is another stop on the pathway of that information going into the nervous system, into the brain, being processed in the brain, and then being output for function back into the world. Right? And every time there's a breakdown at a level, potentially, then it's going to potentially lead to more trouble. And that garbled message that gets spit out at the end, well, like those are our symptoms, right? And so our job as clinicians is to be able to understand what those different levels are and how do we look at where it is and the individual thing and how do we look at how they're supposed to integrate and talk and then how do we treat it. And that is truly the difference. That is why I have clients that are able to fly from all over North America to come work with me because of this approach. That is why we can get change in a week. That doesn't mean someone's healed in a week. Like I always just say that I work in an intensive model, and intensive is not a miracle pool. It's a giant step in the right direction. But that's why we can get these changes in a week when people have been stuck for years because we understand how the systems integrate. We do the deep dive into each of the pieces, and then we step back and look at how they talk, and then we look at how we can utilize the good, the bad, and the ugly to get flowers. Right? And so if you are stepping into a place of persistent concussion or you're working with individuals with persistent concussion, step one is to be that provider who does do that integrative approach. And for the person on the journey, find the provider who does the integrative approach. Now, you may also find a provider that says, because this was me, this approach is new to me, but I'm willing to learn if you're willing to work with me. If someone says that to you, if a provider admits their vulnerabilities to you and says, I want to help you, but this is new to me too, but I'm willing to learn if you're willing to work with me, hold on to that provider for a while. They're being honest with you, and they wouldn't say that if they weren't willing to learn and support you. That's a pretty special person for someone who says that. So step one, if we're still on these symptoms, 30 days, persistent concussion, that's what that means, right? We still have persistent symptoms 30 days after our concussion. We do that multi-systems integrative assessment piece because we know that at that point, there's something else that's going on that's still driving these symptoms that is not going to spontaneously resolve. So what I mean by that is, yes, there can be vestibular findings and visual findings and stuff that happen right after a concussion. Concussion is a functional neurological disturbance to the brain that is reversible, right? When we look at the definition of concussion, is a functional neurological disturbance to the brain that is reversible. And so if there is vestibular or there is visual sometimes in the very beginning, the research has shown that it may and can spontaneously recover within the first 10 days. Spontaneously recover, meaning that whether you did rehab or not, it would resolve. Now, that doesn't mean do nothing for 10 days. Again, go back to the acute modules. But at 30 days, if we're still having symptoms, spontaneous recovery isn't likely to happen, and we need the supportive rehab to help guide that recovery. Okay, so if you are still having persistent symptoms, it is a month in, and you have not done provider, I'm just like beating this to death on this podcast, please connect with somebody. Now, when I say we also need to look at that holistic whole person, this is super important. We need to understand the neurophysiology because that's going to be as a physical therapist, as a chiropractor, as an athletic therapist, as a osteopath, whoever it is that's working with individuals with concussion. That is our application, right? Those are the tools and the skills we have to support the healing of your physiology, right? So that's really important. Like that is the ultimate reason why most people come to us. But particularly in that persistent stage as well, there's some other factors that we need to be looking at. And we probably should have been looking at them in the acute stage as well. But if we haven't been, here we absolutely need to. And this is looking truly at how are you supporting yourself in your life for healing, health, and wellness and recovery. And that can be looking at things like your sleep. Sleep is crucial, which honestly, sleep is something we do want to look in the acute stage. But if you're struggling with sleep, this needs to be a priority. If you're a clinician, please be screening for sleep or asking questions about sleep and prioritizing that as part of the treatment plan. But here's the key is you need to educate. So any of these other pieces we're going to talk about, the most important thing is that you are educating your clients on why you're talking about these things and why you're not doing what they think they're coming to see you for, which is the rehab piece. Okay. So communication is so vital. Sleep, right? So we need to be looking at sleep. We need to be prioritizing sleep. I'm not going to dig into a lot here because we just did a whole podcast episode last week with Dr. Shane Criado about it. Go back and listen to that podcast. But clinicians, please be screening for sleep, because if this is something that isn't going well for our client, 100% something that we need to be talking about. Okay. And we have tools as therapists that we can support on sleep. We need to be looking at other life stressors. Stress is so challenging, right? Stress will be a barrier to recovery. We all have stress in our lives. But if we're in the persistent stage, we need to look at, are there big stressors in your life? And how can we try to minimize those for you to promote a space of healing and health? We need to look at stressors. We need to see, is there an element of trauma? Particularly too, is there trauma from the incident that gave you the concussion? And if there is, let's get you connected with someone if you haven't already to help resolve that. And do you have significant past trauma? And maybe that's something that we need to start to explore. What is your nutrition like? We did a whole episode in the podcast earlier in the very beginning with Dr. Mark Heitzig that talked about the power of nutrition in healing and recovery in the acute and persistent stages. So let's do a check-in on our nutrition. How's our mindset? How's our environment? How's our community of support? All of these pieces over here are equally as important. Some would probably say more important than what we do over here in rehab. And again, if you can see me on the screen, I'm like moving my hands, but you can't see it when you're listening to this. Right? And these pieces over here, the sleep, the nutrition, the movement, which is for your therapist, the mindset, these are all pieces that you can take this empowerment journey on your own and create this amazing foundation for growth and healing. And as a clinician, I encourage you, particularly in the persistent client, these are areas that need to be explored. These pieces could be considered some of the, this is going to sound terrible, but like the low-hanging fruit, right? Because if we can shift our nutritional choices to decrease the inflammation in our body, to help us get more nutrients, then that's creating an even greater environment for the interventions that I would do with you if you came to see me, example, for an intensive. These things aren't one or the other. It's not A or B. It's A and B laced with C and D in this beautiful, cohesive, collaborative, integrative plan. Okay. I feel like I jumped a little bit all over in this episode, but I'm going to pause us because we're at 30 minutes. We're going to be talking a whole bunch about persistent stuff going forward, you guys. Like, hands down, it's going to be the majority of what this podcast is. If you are a clinician listening to this and the thought about wanting to understand those things I talked about with that integrative model and how does A drive B, which drives C, all those pieces, come join me at the beginning of February. We are hosting a masterclass and we're calling it the Concussion Revolution, Becoming Fluent in Concussion Rehabilitation. We truly are creating a space and a revolution where people feel safe to heal and clinicians feel confident in their ability to be guides on that path of doing so. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I want more, and you want to understand more of this piece, drop into the show notes below. There is a link. Register for the masterclass. It is free. It is for clinicians to help you kind of step into that next place of being confident and even more confident in your ability to assess, treat in an integrative rehabilitation approach with concussion. Until next week, my friends, I hope you have an amazing day. Take care. That's today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, give us a like, give us a share, give us a tag on Instagram, and please never hesitate to reach out. We love communicating and connecting with you. Until next week, my friends, have a marvelous day.